listeners, and welcome to the third episode of the Dorian Daily Podcast. I'm very excited to be putting this episode out as we pivot slightly into the academic realm of philosophy. Specifically, we're going to be comparing and contrasting two philosophers, John Stuart Mill and Friedrich Nietzsche, on alternative defenses of individuality and where individuals fit within a overall society. So we're going to be comparing the micro and the macro and what it means to be an individual inside a greater populace. Our quote of the day comes from John Stuart Mill, and it reads, "He who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that." And I think this quote speaks to the fact that, a lot of people partake in somewhat of a selective exposure and only expose themselves to the arguments or the narratives that they see as true. Whereas John Stuart Mill is saying that it's extremely important to understand what your thought opponents or what other people on the other side of a debate or political discussion or argument are saying, and understand it well, because it's the only way that you can strengthen your own position or even challenge your own assumptions, which may turn out to be wrong. So to be open to new points of view and to be able to critically analyze them in order to help strengthen your own understanding of truth and knowledge within the world. And just as an aside, I think in general philosophy is a great way to do that, to understand yourself and to understand things that are going on in the world. I know when I did my undergraduate degree at University of Toronto in the Faculty of Political Science, I was heavily invested in the philosophy component of that department, and I think that it helped prepare me very well in terms of analytical ability and critical reasoning skills and logic. And those are things which I use throughout my studies in law and becoming a lawyer. And I think that I would encourage anybody at the post-secondary level to study in philosophy. I know it seems extremely boring and tedious at the time, but I can tell you that it will help immensely in your critical reasoning skills and your ability to understand yourself and society writ large. So without any further ado, I think we should go into today's topic of alternate defenses of individuality, a comparison of John Stuart Mill and Friedrich Nietzsche. The relationship between the individual and society is a topic of the utmost importance in the philosophies of both John Stuart Mill and Friedrich Nietzsche. Specifically, both philosophers analyze the extent to which societal factors, be they political or cultural, compel individuals to act in a specific manner or adhere to a prescribed lifestyle that is generally accepted as the norm in society. Both theorists ask the critical question of whether or not society is justified in imposing constraints, be they forcibly through the law or morally through public opinion, on the individual, and if not, how should this power over individuals be limited or the relationship between the individual and society reconciled? The purpose of the topic in the conversation today is to analyze Mill's and Nietzsche's views on individuality as they relate to the socio-political and socio-cultural ends of self-development. Chronologically, we will compare the author's interpretations on the present societal landscape which individuals are living, the implications of having a dominant set of values or public opinion, the worth of the counterfactual or alternative value systems, and the implications of these dynamics for both society and the individuals developing, or failing to do so, therein. Both Mill and Nietzsche express a shared concern over societal factors which compel individuals to act in a certain way and prevent them from reaching their true self-determined potential. However, with respect to the ends of this individuality, the thinkers diverge insofar as Mill believes defense of individual liberty ought to be for utilitarian reasons, that is, the greatest good for the greatest number of people, in its most simple form, although there's much differences within the utilitarian school of thought. Whereas Nietzsche is apathetic to social utility, the greatest good for the greatest number, so long as certain individuals can give rise to life-affirming values that propagate throughout the society and become the standard or the benchmark in which others look to emulate and live their lives in such a manner. Mill and Nietzsche see the individuals of present European society or Western society living in vastly different socio-political landscape than those living in centuries past. As per Mill, the chief threat to individual freedom in centuries past had been tyrannical rulers, and it was the prerogative of the people to confer limits on the power to which the ruler should be suffered. In doing so, this act constituted the exercise of their liberty. The relationship between the governing power and the people was adversarial insofar as the two were opposed in interest to themselves, with one seeking to maximize power and the other to limit it. However, there came a time when the people were no longer content with allowing their governing authority to be an independent power standing in contrast to their interests. As a result, the people sought to ensure, in some cases through revolution, delegates of the state were their own representatives and revocable at their pleasure. Such was the transition from a monarchic or feudal society to a democratic polity. While many modern thinkers have argued that this transition was for the betterment of individual liberty, insofar as the people who now had governing power was in their own hands, Mill warns that the opposite may be true in many instances. That is, that both the people and their respective representatives, particularly in a representative democracy, such as we have in Canada and the United States and many British Commonwealth former countries, so that the people and their representatives may be just as tyrannical and suppressive of individual liberty as the rulers of centuries past. Nietzsche, on the other hand, does not provide a comprehensive political trajectory akin to Mill. Rather, he provides insight as to how the changing social environment, grounded principally in morality, has constrained the behavior of modern individuals as much, if not more, than the proliferation of democracy which is central to Mill's work. Morality for Nietzsche is a hierarchy of values, that is, to believe some things to be of more importance than others. To emphasize this, Nietzsche delineates between two dichotomous types of morality, master and slave. Master morality, as was dominant amongst the prophets, warriors, and aristocrats of Homer's time, affirms the strength of the noble, powerful, high-stationed, and high-minded ruling class. And this is in Nietzsche's work, infamous work Beyond Good and Evil. And I should have mentioned this earlier, but the references to John Stuart Mill's work are from his book, his seminal work on liberty. So what characterizes Nietzsche's morality is its exclusivity. That is, not everyone can participate in the master class, and those that occupy its rank establish themselves and their actions as good. Their goodness is exemplified not just in their own character, but their voluntary actions, which are not contingent on the values or morals of any other group. This value system affirms their strength and power in direct contrast to those lower-ranking people who do not rule and are subsequently transformed into the concept of bad. Bad in this context does not confer a value judgment and strictly means the plain, the common, and the normal man. This shows the master morality and the value system it promotes to be one of a small m or non-universal worldview which does not rest on the differentiating value systems that other ranks of people espouse. And this, as an aside, is from Nietzsche's other work, Genealogy of Morals. So those of the lower rung, the non-rulers, were not complacent in their subjugation or being labeled as the bad or the common, and offered an alternative value system, what Nietzsche calls slave morality. This morality was espoused by those people who, in opposing their enemies and conquerors, were satisfied with nothing less than a radical revaluation of their enemies' values, that is, the morality of the master class. They did this by inverting the aristocratic value equation and making it so that the poor, impotent, lowly, and disempowered alone were the good. What this resulted in was not just a revaluation of values, but a transvaluation. That is, that the Judeo-Christian tradition did not merely offer an alternative value system, it sought to delegitimize master morality in its entirety by damning those who do not adhere to their own conception of morality and labeling them evil. Accordingly, the slave revolt in morality had been victorious not just in chastising adherents of master morality, but in subscribing their own morality as the dominant worldview, a large capital M morality. While both thinkers offer differentiating opinions as to how the social landscape has changed, indeed Mill offers a political one in democratization and Nietzsche a sociocultural one in a changing value system, they converge in seeking to address the practical implications such changes have on the individuals living in the modern era. As aforementioned, John Stuart Mill cautions that democratic rule by the people, for the people, risks being just as despotic as rule by the monarch over his subjects or the feudal lord over the serf in centuries past. So how is this so? Mill states that the will of the people in a democratic society most often means the will of the most active or the most numerous parts of the people who constitute a majority. When this group executes its own mandates through public authorities or magistrates, it may do so without consultation of dissenting interests or individuals who oppose the majority. You see this a lot, especially in Canada at the legislative level, be it at the provincial or the federal one, whereby when a majority government has single-member plurality or first-past-the-post system, when they have the majority of seats, they essentially, given the strict party discipline in Canada, you always just vote your color. You vote if you're red, if you're liberal, blue if you're conservative. So given the strict party discipline, the majority government has just like a carte blanche to draft whatever legislation they have, and there's very few checks and balances from the opposition party, apart from occasional, shouting at each other in questioning period or trying to offer some insight into the policies during the committees. But at the end of the day, it's the majority government that's going to be able to draft the legislation in the way that they want it, without any real consideration or debate or discussion with the minority party. And it's a little bit sad in that respect and disenfranchising for Canadian democratic institutions. Maybe we'll do a topic or a conversation one day about the pros and cons of a single-member plurality first-past-the-post system, such as in Canada and the U.S., vis-a-vis a proportional representation system, which is not as conducive to majority governments. This is the case in a lot of Western European nations. And, the incentivization to form alliances and to work with other parties in order to pass legislation, as opposed to just disregarding the opinions of minority parties because you have a majority government and you can pass whatever legislation you'd like. But getting out of that rabbit hole and returning to our friend John Stuart Mill, Mill articulates that the majority, being satisfied with the ways of mankind as they now are, for it is they who make them what they are, cannot comprehend why those ways should not be good enough for everybody in the society. It is this type of thinking that leads the groups that constitute the majority to risk a social tyranny more formidable than many kinds of political oppression, that is, the infamous tyranny of the majority. Specifically, this tyranny transcends sheer political functionaries into the court of public opinion, that amorphous, inhibiting mechanism that prevents individuals from espousing their own views in fear of backlash or suppression from the majority. With the tyranny of the majority, the largest group may utilize their collective force to impose their own will on everybody else in society. The potential for oppression of the individuals in the minority with dissenting views in the circumstance is made obvious. As Mill shows, people have no inclination other than that to which is customary, and actions are subsequently dictated by others, even on such matters that only concern themselves. When recourse to customary practice becomes a societal norm, there is wanting the chief ingredient of individual and social progress. The socio-political consequences for the individuals within the democratic polity cannot be understated. Suppressing dissent or imposing penalties for people's behavior that does not physically harm others is simply unjustifiable in Mill's view and constitutes a complete infringement of individual liberty. If anything, individuality should assert itself every possible chance over the customs of the majority. This is a necessary condition to prevent tyrannical rule by a majority and ensure both freedom and social development to the fullest extent possible. Not to go down another rabbit hole, but you sort of see evidence of this in many forms of modern life. To a certain extent, some would argue at the university level, whereby especially in today's day and age, in a political correctness debates and movement, a force, I guess you should say, or by some students that may have outside the mainstream opinions or views, don't necessarily want to share those in the space, or sometimes they even can't share them because universities are adopting, policies to make things like a safe space. And it's actually, according to Mill, that would be very counterproductive to inhibit people's freedom to talk about things and, discuss their true positions or attitudes towards something. Insofar as, like we said in the quote at the beginning, if you don't know the other person's side of the case, you know very little about your own. So to preclude people from talking for what they believe to be true, so long as it doesn't bring like physical harm to anybody, is counterproductive and detrimental to the human progress and human development. One professor at University of Toronto who became somewhat renowned for this position is Dr. Jordan Peterson. I think if anybody wanted to check out his works, the book Maps of Meaning or the 12 Rules for Life book, and then he also has a podcast, I think. He has some very insightful discussion into that type of topic. But I think for our purposes, we should go back more to the philosophical side, so I'll digress from that. So getting back to our conversation, similar to Mill, Nietzsche also believes that societal influence on individuals has become innately constraining and an impediment to self-development. As aforementioned, Nietzsche delineates between large M slave morality and small m master morality as alternative value systems. The logical question Nietzsche poses is, what is the value of these values themselves? Evidently, the proliferation of slave morality has been a negating value to society, according to Nietzsche. While the master morality of centuries past espoused life-affirming or life-promoting values, by virtue of the fact the nobles did not rely on others to affirm their greatness, but did so by exercising their own strength, power, and benevolence, the slave morality which has imposed itself on the rest of society over the past few thousand years promulgates life-denying values. Its values are life-denying insofar as the slave morality has little to do with self-affirmation of individual power or assertion of strength in and of itself. Rather, slave morality is making virtuous the complete opposite of life-affirming values, such as obedience, powerlessness, and weakness, all of which are contingent on one's relative position in relation to others in society. Indeed, the powerless become the pious, in Nietzsche's view. The implications of this transvaluation, or large M morality, for the individual in the modern era have been manifold. Firstly, that modern society is still defined by slave morality, which presents itself as the only acceptable value system. As Nietzsche posits, with slave morality, it is no longer the consequences but the origin of an action that one allows to decide its value. If one does not adhere to the predominant values espoused by slave morality or the majority, they are seen as evil, regardless of what they intend to accomplish with their actions. It is this value system which has led to the diminution and leveling of European man that constitutes our greatest danger. Moreover, Nietzsche sees this as having led to an innocent nihilistic tendency, a belief in nothing, and has ultimately led people to become weary of man. It is evident that both Mill and Nietzsche share a belief that the socio-political or socio-cultural forces in modern society have inhibited individuals from being the determiners of their own self-development, either through democratic mechanisms or universal value systems, respectively. The question then becomes, how do these authors reconcile this modern tension between an inhibiting society and constrained individual? Interestingly, both theorists agree it is no longer acceptable for everyone to be made all alike or simply be a mediocre member of the herd, as Nietzsche would call it. Society needs to give rise to great individuals who have the power to transgress the court of public opinion, the tyranny of the majority, and the deeply entrenched moral values that go promulgated uncontested. As Nietzsche would posit, to enable the rise of strong-willed individuals, or higher humans, who will institute an era of cultural and social renewal by promulgating new ideas of individualism, generosity, and self-sufficiency, all generate from self-sustaining and life-affirming values. For Mill, the The superior person is someone who constantly questions the majority opinion and presents non-customary ways of doing things. Perhaps they will be not in the right, or perhaps the person will even be wrong. Regardless, society needs to encourage these dissenting opinions, insofar as society gains more even by the errors of one who, with due study and preparation, thinks for themselves. As has been demonstrated throughout history, such as with the execution of Socrates, circumstances and prevailing opinions constantly change, and what was right at one time may prove to be wrong in the future. In the case of Socrates, after being put to death and being forced to drink the hemlock for corrupting the youth, those in ancient Athens were quite remiss a few weeks after the execution of Socrates, and many people in the court of public opinion said maybe it wasn't such a good idea that we killed such a brilliant man. By assuming the majority infallible, Mill states that we flatter ourselves that we are the most progressive people who ever lived. In truth, this makes us the most complacent. The onus of the political functionaries that compromise society then becomes to stop its war against individuality and to promote individual freedom in expression, in association, and in thought. These liberties must be maximized to the fullest extent possible, so long as it does not cause physical harm, even if doing so defies social norms, customs, or offends individuals in society. This is the only way that utility will be maximized and the greatest good for the greatest number of people will be assured. For utility, in Mill's perspective, is the ultimate appeal on all ethical questions, but it is one that does not undermine, indeed it promotes, the interest of each individual's interest, not just that of the majority. Contrary to Mill, Nietzsche does not offer a political guide, or in the context of his work, an objective conception of morality, to show how new value systems may arise that transgress the inherently life-denying slave morality. What Nietzsche does confer is the possibility for a certain type of person to distance themselves from the herd or the general populace and to give rise to new life-affirming values. While these individuals will be few and far between, they will not exhibit weakness, obedience, or deference to some outer worldly power, one that may no longer exist. Rather, these exceptional individuals will display a will to power. That is, they will strive to grow, spread, seize, become predominant, and show a will not just to live, but to prosper. This being will overcome the herd mentality and will refuse to believe that that which is useful is only something that can be used by everybody, or be of the benefit to the greatest number of people. For this individual's personal affirmation, in and of itself, will lead to progress, independent of the herd or the general populace. It is in this sense that Nietzsche fundamentally disagrees with Mill's conception of liberty so as to promote utility. Nietzsche's greater individuals will not promote the greatest good for the greatest number. For the greatest number, or the general populace, simply want to will life and nothing else, nothing greater, or nothing that affirms one's own self. To recap, both theorists express a shared concern over the determination of oneself and the constraining forces in society that prevent one from reaching their true potential. While the thinkers diverge with respect to what these forces are, Mill arguing democratization, which prevents development, and Nietzsche a capital M morality, both agree that transgression of modern social norms will be necessary to escape the plateauing of all individuals at some mediocre standard. For Mill, this will be done for utilitarian purposes, conferring the greatest good for the greatest number of people. For Nietzsche, the greatest number of people simply do not have the will to exert any profound influence or power beyond a mere base of self-preservation. Yet, as both would agree, society needs to enable exceptional individuals, if and when they do come about, to be as free as possible and not have their actions determined by anyone other than their own self. For this is the only way in which the betterment of society and the individuals within it will come about. Thank you. So I hope that you enjoyed this conversation. I would strongly encourage anybody listening to this podcast to read any of John Stuart Mill or Friedrich Nietzsche's works. John Stuart Mill, in his book On Liberty and Other Essays, is just a seminal work and something that definitely made me question the world. And I think it's one of those books that I can read over and over again and learn something new from every time I read it. And Friedrich Nietzsche, both in his works on the genealogy of morals and Beyond Good and Evil, while extremely difficult books to read, I think they're absolute masterpieces in terms of both prose and thought and intellect. And it's just truly mesmerizing to try and be on Nietzsche's level as far as, critical thinking and understanding. And I think it's something that, if you do read through, it will help you in your analytical skills and abilities and be able to question the world around you and expand your mind. So for that, I'd like to say thank you for listening, and I look forward to speaking with everyone again. Take care.